Hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight and welcome to tonight's webinar, Making Children Visible in Work with Parents. Before we begin, MHPN wishes to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands across Australia upon which our webinar presenters and participants are located tonight. We wish to pay respect to the elders past, present and future for the memories, the traditions, the culture and hopes of Indigenous Australia. And I'd just like to take this moment to invite you to share in the chat box which lands you're joining us from this evening. While you're doing that, I'll just introduce myself. My name is Jacquie Lee and I'll be facilitating tonight's session for you. I've been working with Emerging Minds for almost 3 years now as a digital publisher and editor within the communications team. So my role involves liaising with authors to produce engaging, innovative, evidence-based content across a variety of mediums, including webinars, and requires a comprehensive knowledge of issues and support strategies related to infant and child mental health. And it's kind of a dream job for me because it allows me to use the skills from both my media and my psychology undergrad degrees. And when I was studying, I never could have imagined that a job like this existed. So I'm very grateful and I'm really pleased to be with you all here tonight. So welcome to the first webinar in our 4th series with MHPN. In the coming months of 2021, we'll be bringing you webinars on using an intergenerational lens when working with children and parents on the 23rd of September, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in November. And then in 2022, we'll be looking at working with parents of infants and toddlers, strategies for case formulation with children, and working with Aboriginal children and families. Make sure you're subscribed to the Emerging Minds newsletter. You can see the link there at the bottom of the screen. That way you'll be the first to hear when registrations open for each of those webinars. So tonight, each panellist will be giving a short presentation followed by a question and answer session with the whole panel. You would have seen the aim and the learning outcomes for tonight's webinar when you registered. So in the interest of time, we won't go through them now. Instead, I will introduce you to tonight's panellists. You would have received a copy of everyone's bios when you registered. So we'll skip over that and get straight into it. First of all, I'd like to introduce Rachael Dean, our child and family partner. Hi, Rachael. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Jackie.
I was wondering, as a child and family partner, what have you found important in your engagement with professionals?
Honesty and people being straight up with me. So I know that sort of thing, but and empathy, definitely.
Yeah, definitely. So kind of traits that you would want out of any relationship, anyone in your life, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Dan Moss, our Workforce Development Manager at Emerging Minds. Hey, Dan. How you going?
Hi, Jackie.
Dan, I know Emerging Minds does a lot of work with practitioners and parents with lived experience of adult-focused services. What are the messages you hear about making children visible in those services?
Yeah, I think the short answer to that really is that both child and family partners and practitioners are aligned in their belief that it's actually, if not the most important, then one of the absolutely most important things that any practitioner in an adult-focused service can do. I think we're privileged to work with many amazing child and family partners such as Rachael, who tell us that they seek an adult-focused service for the primary motivating factor that they want to achieve change for themselves and for their children. And we also work with a lot of adult-focused practitioners who have told us some really transformative stories about how making a child visible in the room has really made sure that a parent makes change in their life.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I've seen that through my own work here as well, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more about that through Rachael's presentation in particular. Thanks, Dan. And finally, we're joined tonight by Clare Kapdor, who is a social worker at Centrecare. That's actually a succinct summary of her many varied, impressive titles there. Thank you for joining us tonight, Clare.
Thank you, Jackie, for having me.
One of those roles at Centrecare is in family law counselling. Mm-hmm. What are the key considerations for you when looking to make children visible in this area?
Yes, it can be really difficult when parents are separating and facing so much stress and frustration, because often by the time they're coming to family law counselling or a family dispute resolution, it's because things have been challenging. It maybe hasn't been an easy separation, and potentially there's been trauma such as domestic violence in the relationship. And understandably, parents can become very focused on adult issues in that experience. And although want to do best by their children, it's so hard to put sometimes hurt and sadness and despair and grief to the side in order to focus on what children need most in this. And understandably, one of the biggest factors of that is, how much do I get to see my child? And so we use a variety of tools. I mean, we thankfully, we're very upfront about the fact that when parents come in for family law counselling, we put on the table at the very beginning that this is about maintaining a child focus, even if we're only seeing the parents and not the children. That is the primary aim of our service, is to help and support parents co-parent their children and bring those children to the front. And child inclusive practice in family mediation is another great way for children's voices to be heard, particularly by parents.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Clare. I feel like we could do a whole webinar just on that with you. Yeah, maybe we'll make a note of that for next year. Cool. Thank you all again so much for joining us, and thanks to the over 600 of you who are tuned in live with us as well. I'm sure there's probably even more than that now. So just before we get started, tonight's webinar focuses on the case study of Clare, who has recently told her GP that she wants to sort out her drinking. Clare is separated from her husband, Jeremy, who has a history of abusive behaviour, but still has some contact with Clare and the kids. Clare is concerned about the impact of Jeremy's violence on their two sons, Ethan and Harry, and also about what the boys think of her drinking. Clare's GP has referred her to see an AOD counsellor. So I'd like to invite our first presenter, Rachael, to take the floor. Thanks, Rachael.
No worries, thank you. Okay, so I just thought I'd start my part off with just a little story about myself, my own experience, and how that shows to me, and hopefully to you when you hear it, just how easily opportunities can be missed, in the office. So years ago, my husband and I, we sought out some counselling together because we had like substance misuse issues at the time, and we both had trouble controlling our tempers. We used to go to the office, and we used to take our 3-year-old child along with us at the time, and she would play on the floor in the office while we were getting counselling. One day, as we were talking about what made us angry at each other, things began to escalate, voices got raised, some not so nice things got said. And I was so involved in what was in the actual argument with my husband that I didn't notice at the time that my daughter was so frightened, and she'd crawled under the desk of the worker and of the counsellor, and she was obviously seeking refuge. But while she was under there, she found the panic button that belonged to the counsellor, and she was pushing it over and over and over again. And the next minute, all these people came bursting into the room expecting something, I suppose, to be really bad going on. And we all just sort of, we just sat there thinking, what's going on? And they were looking at us like, what's going on? And the counsellor looked under the table and she'd seen our daughter, and she had the panic button in her hand. And then we all sort of realised that it was our daughter that was sitting there with the panic button, which had made them come in the room. And he sort of just laughed it off at the time, and everyone left and we stayed in the room. But what amazes me about that whole thing was that would have been a really good opportunity to bring up to us just how our issues were affecting our child, and they never were. So it should have been obvious to us as parents that our daughter was frightened, but it wasn't. It should have been obvious to the counsellor that our daughter was frightened, but she didn't say anything. So, in fact, all the sessions that we had with her in the future, never once did it get brought up about how our arguing in front of our child was affecting her development. So I just think that's a bit of a picture about how easily opportunities can be missed, even though it was so blatantly happening right in front of everybody. So I don't want to excuse my own lack of insight there either. But the counsellor, and not to blame the counsellor, but I just feel that she did miss an opportunity to bring up with us what our arguing was doing. Because there is a problem, I think, especially with people that are in substance abuse problems, that we tend to live in a bit of a bubble, and we do think very self-centeredly that what we're doing is only affecting us, and we don't sometimes realise just how much it affects people outside of our own bubble, especially our children. We might sort of realise that on a superficial level, but the old adage of, I'm only hurting myself is so not true. Definitely not true for parents and not true for guardians. So it could have made all the difference if I'd have learnt back then the effects of addiction and violence on children. So I just wanted to use that to show just how easily opportunities to talk specifics involving children can go unheeded. Next slide. So, fear of the mandated notifier. I often had the impression, and have even been told by practitioners, that it's nerve-wracking to bring up the fact that you're a mandated notifier, often fearing that the client would think negatively straight away and make a run for it. However, it is only fair that your client's fully informed. So it also opens the fact that problems are not just the individuals alone. If they have family, particularly children, then it's only fair that they understand the impact of their own actions. Sometimes I think the assumption is that these people already know that they're having an impact, and they probably do realise that to some degree. However, they may not really grasp what that impact is. They may not be, as I wasn't at the time, fully aware of the implications of that impact on their children. They know something's not right, and that they know that what they're doing is sort of considered wrong by the majority of society. However, they may not really understand why. They may not have been taught about the developing brain and what happens to a child growing up in that fight or flight mode. So being aware of mandated notification, to me, it's like the first step of awareness beyond yourself. It might be that first glimpse of, oh, hey, my drug addiction or my alcohol addiction or the DV situation I'm in, it's not just affecting me, it's affecting my children. And then you can teach them the hows and the whys and how it affects a child and why the child may be acting out the way they are. And if they are. And rather than seeing mandation as a way to shut down your clients or scare them off, it can be used to open conversations that include the whole family's well-being. It could be that opening these conversations gives the parent or parents the tools they need to change. You can certainly educate them on child development, things they may never have heard before. And then they may come to understand why the state and professionals with whom they may be seeking advice from takes the responsibility of mandated notification so seriously. Next slide. So starting open and honest conversations. So I feel that with the scenario, we can see that the mother, Claire, is already aware that her drinking and the violence is already affecting her children, but she doesn't quite know how to deal with it. However, she's keen to stop relying on alcohol as a self-soothing technique for herself. And all those things are conversation starters. I got the feeling Claire would be willing to learn more about how her issues are affecting her children. I get that the service is for Claire to help her with her problems, but leaving the children invisible can have dire consequences. And even though the service may be aimed at Claire, like at the adult, we can't forget she is a mother. And so what she does or what she doesn't do is affecting her children too. So learning more about that just might be what she needs. It may give her the extra incentive she needs to change, if not for herself, then for her children. It wouldn't hurt to bring up other scenarios with her, using them to explain what her family is likely going through. Sometimes, especially in the beginning, generalising the whole thing, applying other scenarios, is easier than pointing out her specific behaviours and how detrimental they can be. Other scenarios offer her some time to listen and then draw parallels with her own life and her own situation. It also mitigates the feelings of blame and shame. If you hear that other people have also struggled and received help, then you can feel hopeful, hope that you can also fix things, which is important, as being overwhelmed by shame can lead you to shut out and turn off, because who wants to feel that hopeless? Helping parents explore the effects of their issues comes a little easier when they have the hope and confidence that they can change too. Next slide. So strengths-based practice helped me, and I feel that this is like the best way to get the best out of your client. Like usually when you're seeking help from a counsellor, it's because you realise you need some help to change something you don't particularly like about yourself or your relationship with a partner or even with your children. But what can be helpful is hearing that not everything you do is wrong or bad. Listening to your client and picking out things they already are doing well and telling them that can give them the boost they need to keep going. Everyone has strengths, just like we all have weaknesses. However, using the strengths to encourage people to build upon those rather than being focused on things they may not be doing so well is encouraging and helps people feel accomplished. It can lead to wanting to accomplish more, opening them up to learning new things. The same should be said for times when a person shows insight into how they're affecting other people in their lives. Don't miss an opportunity to build up rapport and to build up your client's self-esteem about themselves. And this is likely to lead to better outcomes for the whole family. So if someone shows insight, acknowledge it and make them feel good about it. If I thought or had been told everything I did was wrong, I would have just crawled up into a ball and given up. However, being told that I had obvious love for my children, and that is a strength, and it was easily built upon, conversations about love turned into conversations about attachment, something I didn't know anything about originally. However, using my love for my kids as a strength base and the fact it was acknowledged really encouraged me to learn by asking more questions. I think that was because they made me feel proud of my strengths. So I was empowered rather than feeling constantly put down because of my problems. Next slide. So visuals in the office and being innovative. because there are many ways to use your environment to get messages across to people frequenting your office. One worker I met used to keep other people's service cards on her desk, or on a, not her desk, but on a little desk in the corner of her office. And at least once during every session, she would sort of try to leave the room or try to turn her back. And she said the funny thing was she never or rarely ever seen anybody take the cards, but by the end of the week, they would all be gone and she'd have to replace them. So she knew they were being used. So there's other ways that you can use your environment as well. Imagine when people are in the waiting room, there's a plethora of information sheets that can be made available for them to read. And even in the office, you can put posters on your wall that say things like, worried about how your drinking is affecting your children? Ask me. Things that are hard to say to people can be put into posters and put on the wall, and they will be read or looked at over and over again. And sooner or later, someone might just surprise you and say, well, can you tell me about this, please? It's like using your environment as an extension of things you wished you had the time to say to everyone. But perhaps the best thing is that when someone does ask you to explain more about one of your visuals, it's the clients using their own initiative, which is great. They will feel it was their own idea, and you will have an opportunity to teach someone something otherwise that they may not have brought up. So using your office space in this way will say a lot about you and the types of things you're willing to discuss. The possibilities are pretty much endless depending on how creative you want to be. But even if you're not the creative type, it's pretty easy to print out on an A4 piece of paper with a few words on it to hang on your wall. Okay, that's it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rachel. That was really valuable to hear about your own personal experience and to hear both what, that situation where your 3-year-old daughter was kind of invisible to the practitioner, but also the flip side, those experiences of strengths-based practice and how much they made a difference to you. So yeah, thank you for sharing that with us.
Thank you.
Next, I'd like to invite Dan to share with us the workforce development perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Jackie. And thank you, Rachel. I fear that's going to be a hard act to follow somehow, but here goes nothing. So why do we need to, in adult-based services, firstly ask adults if they're parents, and secondly ask parents how their current concerns or adversities might be affecting their children? And the reason we need to do that is really clear. If we look at kids as young as 4 to 7 years old in this country at the moment, we know that 1 in 7 of them qualify for some sort of diagnosis of a mental health condition. Of those 1 in 7, 1 in 6 of those children currently receives help. So we know this. We know that many children out there who are doing it tough are flying under the radar, and it's most often parents who can do something about that, and parents who are accessing a really supportive practitioner for their own concerns or adversities are most likely to be able to be connected to the supports they need. Next slide, thanks, Jackie. So when we first started to think about how we can help practitioners develop a framework which does make sure that children are visible in the room, we spoke to many adult-focused practitioners around Australia. Overwhelmingly, they told us that inquiring about children is one of the most important elements of their practice, and often, as Rachel was talking about, a key to parental motivation for change. But they also talked about time restraints, confusion around role definition, or actually whether it was part of their role to ask about kids. Some of them talked about lacking confidence in asking parents about their relationship with their children. Some of them said, I don't want to open a can of worms. I'm sure that's a kind of saying that many of you in services have heard. You know, what if I have to make a child protection notification? Again, as Rachel was talking about. What if I say something which puts the parent offside and they never come back? And also lots of these practitioners told them that they worked in an environment where there was an absence of assessment questions about parenting. So if they ask one question about a child, what's their second, third and fourth question going to be? Next slide, thanks, Jackie. So this is where Emerging Minds have worked with those practitioners really intensively over the last few years to come up with a set of questions which really focus on particular domains of a child's life. So they become much more specific and give practitioners a way to inquire about children in ways which are non-judgmental, ways which don't stigmatise but display genuine curiosity. So those domains of a child's life really are parent-child relationships, emotions and behaviours, routines, communication and meaning-making and support networks. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those in the case of Clare now. Next slide. So what we know about Clare at the moment is that she's got full-time custody of the kids, Harry and Ethan, and she does that because of a result of Jeremy's violence. We know that Clare is drinking a little bit too much, but she's also talked to the practitioner about why it's important to her, not to let Ethan see her drinking. So a really strong question in that case would be, Clare, what helped you to stop drinking on that particular night when you saw that Ethan was awake? Really, that's talking to an ethic that Clare has about wanting to present a certain way to her son in not having him worry about her drinking and being the kind of mother that puts her own children's needs above her own. So I think there are so many rich and engaging questions that even those slight bits of information provide for us as practitioners. Next slide, thanks, Jackie. In terms of emotions and behaviours, there's lots of stuff there which Clare is telling the practitioner around how Harry and Ethan are presenting. And really, we've got some very definite recent events which tell us that Harry and Ethan might be exhibiting behaviours or concerns about what they've seen Jeremy do. So you might ask a question like, Claire, you mentioned that you had a conversation with Harry the other night about Jeremy's violence. How do you think Harry made sense of what he saw? Now, importantly, that is not blaming Clare for her ex-male partner's use of violence, but it is really making Harry and Ethan's emotions and behaviours visible in the room. So you can do two things by that. You can work with Clare to think about how she can work with Harry and Ethan so that they can have the conversations that they need to have to feel supportive. But also, just as importantly, you can help Clare to make herself see that she's not responsible for Jeremy's use of violence, that this is not something that has been her fault. Next slide, thanks, Jackie. When we talk about routines, these are often the things when parents are experiencing substance use issues or mental health issues or family violence that go out the window. The bedtime routine of reading stories or the having dinner at the same time every night or the having chats around the table. So in this case, the practitioner has a real opportunity to understand from Clare what it's like at the moment to be a single parent having full-time care of Harry and Ethan. I would be willing to guess that there are some things that Clare is doing to make sure that there are some routines that are being followed for Harry and Ethan. And some of those things might be around making sure that Harry goes to footy training or Ethan goes to Scouts. Again, asking Clare about those routines might be a real impetus for developing her confidence as a single parent, but it also might generate other opportunities to establish routines in the life of Harry and Ethan, because at the moment they probably really need and value those routines given it has been such an unsettling time. Next slide, thanks, Jackie. in terms of communication and meaning making, what we know from all of our work with children is that where they've been forced to experience violence or parental chaos or uncertainty, children overwhelmingly make sense of those events in ways that have themselves front and centre as the people to blame. And so it will be really important in this case to be talking to Claire about how her children are making meaning, of the violence that Jeremy's exhibited, and also in a gentle way, having her think or consider how they might make sense of her drinking. And just to be thinking about what conversations that she's had with Harry and Ethan about what happened with Jeremy. Or how do you think the boys might be making sense of what has happened in the past? Again, this is a really gentle way of allowing the opportunity for Claire's parenting ethics to come to the fore, because it's really clear that she wants her children to make sense of what's happening in a way that they don't feel blamed or responsible for what's happened. She wants to take responsibility for how their children are thinking about the events that surround them. Next slide. Thanks, Jacquie. So the support network's part of the what we call the PERCS domains is really to help the parent consider their children's support needs and how other relationships in their lives, whether that's a grandparent, whether that's someone at school, whether that's a friend, can help create a network that is effective in helping Harry and Ethan maintain safety. They have someone to look out for them if they're not travelling so well. So I think there's real evidence that Claire's doing this in the connections with Scouts and footy, but it would be really, I think, opportune at the moment for that practitioner to be thinking about, with Claire, about other people in their lives who can, have Harry and Ethan's back. So that's, I think, really important. So what I've described there is what we've now called the PERCS domains. Emerging Minds have developed a lot of example questions, which are going to be in the references and tonight, which Jacquie will talk about later. And this is really for us, I think, the beginning of that journey. We've started with some questions which, from some pilots we've done, we know are being effective in helping adult-based practitioners in asking questions, but we really want to continue this conversation with all of you to make sure that this framework is as effective and user-friendly as possible. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dan. That was a really interesting, succinct introduction to the PERCS framework. It feels really user-friendly and I'm sure we could unpack that more as well, and hopefully we'll get to in the Q&A section. As Dan mentioned, you can download a copy of the guide by clicking on the information icon and on the resources link there. In that information section, you should also find a copy of the slides for tonight's webinar as well. Thank you. I'd now like to invite Claire to finish off the presentation portion of tonight's webinar by giving us the social worker perspective.
Thanks, Jacquie. I wanted to do a little bit of focus tonight on the Ecomap tool, which as a social worker was something that I learnt about when I first started practicing, but really only more recently, particularly learning about family therapy, have really seen so much more benefits and interesting ways to use this. If you're not familiar with an Ecomap, you might know the term genogram or family tree. And so an Ecomap is a genogram, but you're also putting in non-related significant people such as family, friends, neighbours, organisations that you might be involved with, such as a school or a sporting club, community centre, spirituality, if that's a big part of a client's life, that could be on the Ecomap as well, and even pets are really quite important. And then what you do is you use that genogram to then draw maps of the nature of the relationships between the different members on the Ecomap, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The great thing about Ecomaps is when you create them collaboratively with your client. I myself have, sat with a psychologist or a counsellor, and as I'm telling them who's who in my family, I can see them, jotting that down on a piece of paper for their own notes. But it's great to get the whiteboard markers and the whiteboard, or your texters and some large pieces of paper, even sit next to your client if that space is comfortable, and ask them to help you draw this so it becomes something that you create together. And it's a really good way to engage, and a really great way then to naturally start asking about all the people in the client's life, particularly the children, and in Claire's case, Harry and Ethan. You can directly start to ask about the children. But the great thing about Ecomaps is it doesn't have to be in relation to the problem that the client's presenting with. You're really going in and finding all about who this person is in front of me, separate to the problem that they've come to talk to you about, and asking them about their children that's completely separate to the problem, which is a great way to introduce children into the room in a non-shaming and non-blaming way. It also, as particularly Rachael was talking about strengths-based practice, it really is a great way of visualising and making it really clear about what are the strengths and resources that Clare has in her network. And, that can be quite a powerful tool to take parents through. So next slide. Okay, so what I did here is I just sat down and created an Ecomap that I thought Clare might have. And as you can see, there's a lot going on there, and something like this might take you the whole hour session if you're lucky enough to have an hour with Clare to create. It might even take more of that, because it's about stopping and asking questions along the way, which is what makes it engaging. As you can see, we've done in black all the people and the relationships. We've got pets, we've got schools, Scouts, soccer, the drug and alcohol counsellor. And then I've got up in the top right-hand corner is sort of a bit of a key for then mapping the relationships. So green in this instance is if a relationship is a good, strong, close relationship. Red is if it's a fractured and stressful relationship. And neutral is maybe if that person's in your life because you're related, but possibly they live somewhere else and you don't really have any contact with that person. And then you'll notice some, say for instance, if we look from Clare to her father Jack, I've done a green line with some red stripes through it. That's indicating that it's a close relationship, but it has its moments of stress in it. So this is, again, a great externalising tool to sit with a client and look at where are all your strengths. And from there, we can immediately see in Clare's life that she's just got a lot of green. There's a lot of green, a lot of good close relationships and people and resources she can draw on. It's also a great way to look at Harry and Ethan, bring them visually straight into the room with you through this tool, and start, asking curious questions about their relationships with people, why it might look like that, and so on. Next slide, thanks, Jackie. Okay, so it will get messy. That was quite a neat one I did, but some people have huge families, people who say, oh, I've got 11 siblings. An Aboriginal colleague of mine once said, I'd need meters and meters of paper to map out my family. So, depending on your role and what your profession is and the purpose of your client, you might look at minimising to just the immediate family, just a couple of generations and things like that. Maybe not getting the names of everyone if there's 11 siblings and 35 first cousins. And symbol use is flexible. I would just encourage people, if you want other people to understand and you're not using traditional symbols, maybe draw up a key so that other practitioners who might be needing to look at that, or just as a reminder for the client themselves, is to map a little key of what symbols you're using. I've just grabbed the ones on the left, just off the internet. If you're looking for examples, there's lots and lots of things out there, and different people do it different ways. For instance, if you are working with LGBTQI clients, you might want to consider using cloud shapes instead of the traditional squares and circles for gender. Also, if you're in a non-counselling profession, you might just want to use a simpler genogram, just who's in the household. Thanks, Jackie. Okay. And then again, bringing out the Ecomap in every session, giving a copy to the client to take away, but bringing it out, again, just as a really easy way to immediately make the children visible in the room by pulling it out and referencing back and using those strengths-based questions that assist the client to really get into the shoes of their children and start seeing it from their perspective. Dan's given some great questions. Some, sort of circular relational questions might include, do you think Ethan feels closer to you when you're not drinking or you stop drinking? What does he do that makes you think he feels closer to you? And then try to get the parent to really look into the perspective of their children. If we asked Harry to answer this question, what do you think Harry would say? If we asked Ethan this question, what do you think Ethan would say about this? How would Ethan know that you're putting him first? What looks different? So there's a lot of different questions, and as Dan said, he's going to give some resources there for examples of questions. Thanks, Jackie.
Thank you so much, Claire. That was a really interesting introduction to Ecomaps and genograms. Someone in the chat has actually asked where you can get training on Ecomaps.
That is a really good question that maybe I could answer later, Jackie, and you could email out. I actually, I'm doing a graduate diploma of family therapy myself, so I'm learning about it there, but I also did it as part of my social work degree. But you can actually purchase whole books on Ecomaps, so absolutely. And there's lots of internet-based free resourcing as well around the use of genograms. I don't know of any specific professional development activities, though, off the top of my head.
Yeah, sure. No worries. If anyone else in the chat or joining us tonight knows and wants to share some links for that person, please jump into the chat box. It's the icon with 2 speech bubbles from memory. Thank you again, Claire, for that presentation, and to Rachael and Dan as well. They were 3 such rich insights into what might be going on for Claire, and it was really great to see as we went along how everything you were talking about fit together. So the Ecomaps and the genograms fitting with the PERCS domains, fitting with the strengths-based practice that Rachael mentioned. So that's great. We've now come to the Q&A portion of tonight, and thank you to the almost 1,000 people who are now tuned in with us. Don't forget you can submit your questions for the presenters by clicking on the speech bubble icon, I believe. Let me just check that. In the lower right corner of your screen. So everyone, we've got some great questions coming through already. To start off with, I was wondering, this question might initially be good for Dan, but can be directed to everyone. The PERCS Conversation Guide has been designed to support conversations between practitioners and parents, but how can it help parents to talk with their kids about the challenges they're facing?
Yeah, thanks, Jackie. Great question too. So really, I think PERCS is designed to think really specifically about what is important to children. And so the design of that included parents, it included practitioners and some children. So really what we think we have are the important elements of a child's life, and those elements that can be affected through family or parental adversity. So we think these questions are fairly important, not only for a practitioner to be having with a parent, but it is absolutely possible and appropriate for the practitioner to be talking with the parent about how they might be inquiring of their own children, you know, for example, around how they're making meaning of things that happen at the moment, or what their behaviours might be telling them. So, we'll really hope that they're kind of transferable and usable in both settings.
Yeah, great. Rachael, as a parent, do you, and I know you've only had a brief introduction to the PERCS domains and those example questions, but do you think they could have been helpful for you to chat to your kids about what was going on?
Yeah, I do. I would take advantage of anything that with a bit of nuance like that in it. I would definitely take advantage and learn more about it to use it for sure.
Yeah, great. We've got a question here from Taylor who says, I work for Lifeline Australia, so we give short-term support to parents and sometimes even children. Considering our support is so short for our help seekers, what do you think would be the most important thing to do or include in our work with parents, children, etc.? Throw that open to the floor.
I think when you are doing such short-term work, and it's so important because I know a lot of people who contact Lifeline haven't approached other counselling services first, and often it's their first introduction, don't be afraid of asking about children. Rachel's given us some really strong evidence as to why it is okay, and just ask respectfully, do you have any children? Tell me a little bit about them, and, invite the person on the phone. Have you ever thought about, getting more support to help you and your children, and phrasing it so not just you, but a support to help you and your children, and looking at doing those referrals on, given the short-term nature of Lifeline. But if that question is embedded at Lifeline, where a lot of people make their first calls to, it's not going to be unusual when they start hearing it carried through by all people in the industry.
Yeah, great. Dan, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I suppose a little bit similar to Clare, but, I think it's, and most of you here are probably doing work with parents. It's amazing how often a parent will have their interest sparked about something different that they can do with their child, or some way they can make change in the lives of themselves and their child by one small conversation. And I think time restraints is often a big anxiety point for practitioners, that, you can't do a conversation justice. Sometimes it's just that 1 5 or 10 minute conversation about a parent's children that really motivates them and inspires them to seek further help or to try something different. That one conversation can be the springboard to many other conversations with either professional or personal people in their lives, which charts a course for really significant change in their lives and the lives of that child.
Great, thank you. A question from Jacqueline Peterson around, I guess it goes back to your story, Rachael. You were quite engaged and willing to sort of seek support and do the work. But what would you recommend in a case where the parent has is experiencing some adversity, the parents aren't united in their approach, and they don't see how their behaviour is affecting the child. So in Jacqueline's example, the kids don't have any routines in place at home, and the parents are struggling to see the importance that establishing routine is their responsibility. They're kind of seeing it as the child just not wanting to do schoolwork or acting out.
I think we take for granted sometimes that we expect people to know all these things. And, you know, it's obvious that a lot of us may never have heard, you know, we don't even understand that routines are going to make our life easier as well as our child's, you know. So I would sort of just encourage people to, you know, listen and learn the dynamic of the family and how it is operating, and then, you know, try and engage them into understanding how it's not only going to help the children, but it's going to help them as well. So, yeah, I think that would be a pretty good approach. But
yeah, that's a great point. Claire or Dan, did you have any thoughts from more of a practitioner's perspective?
I have one, Dan. Are you okay for me to? So I'm just thinking there's a particular framework, and if anyone wants to look it up, it's ARC framework, which is attachment, regulation and competency. And it's great. And what you can do is really use the analogy with parents of building blocks or a house. You know, in jobs where I've had limited resources, I bought some plastic cups and stacked them, and you've got 4 rows on the bottom, and then 3, and then 2 and 1, like a pyramid. And what you're doing is you're giving an analogy to the parents that the base for the children, those 4 base blocks, that's what parents have to put in place for children. That's establishing that foundation. And without that there, if you even take one away, and funnily enough, routines and boundaries is one of the 4 bases there. And if any of those 4 are taken out and not there, the rest of the pyramid can collapse in. So again, it's a great way of externalizing, using a visual tool. You can literally build it up with your clients and pull one out, and then doing some psychoeducation gently with parents around, you know, we know that this is what children thrive with, and this is where what parents have to put in before children can start participating in the next row up. So that's the ARC framework.
Thanks, Claire. I hadn't heard of the ARC framework before, but it sounds like, as you say, a really great practical visual to work through with parents. Thank you. We've got a great question here from Claudia, who asks, how can you repair trust with a parent if you have raised a question that they may not be ready to answer? And Claire or Rachel, maybe would you like to give us a parent's perspective?
So did you say, how would you repair trust?
Yeah, so if you were working with someone and they asked a question that you kind of didn't feel ready to answer, and that kind of caught you off guard and ruptured the therapeutic relationship a little bit, how could that professional repair that trust with you?
Well, I hope they wouldn't break that trust with just one question to start with. But but if they sort of do, then I would just sort of give the parents some time perhaps to think it through, maybe not press them too hard straight away. Just give them a bit of time to absorb it, and then when they're ready, perhaps ask them again or prompt them. But yeah, I wouldn't try to destroy the trust in the first place, I think. So,
no.
I mean, people might not want to answer things, but, you know, often with a bit of time, to absorb something and to get a bit of context too, to understand why you're being asked that question and what it really means. Then usually I think people are pretty happy to talk about themselves.
Yeah, for sure. Dan, correct me if I'm wrong, but the PERCS conversation guide, it's kind of been designed for you to ask these questions in a kind of safe, respectful way. And they're also designed to be used over multiple sessions. Is that right?
Yeah, that is right, Jackie. And it really does look at continually looking for entry points and opportunities to have these conversations with parents. And you don't need to start off by asking a question which is going to be potentially shaming or stigmatising of a parent. In Clare's case, just a simple question to start with about how Harry's doing. How did Ethan go at Scouts or during the week? It's really often a lovely way of just normalising the fact that in your interactions with Clare or any other parent, that you're going to be interested in their life. And, for Clare and for most parents, the most important thing in their life is their child. And so I think that as adult-based practitioners, we can become highly trepidatious that we're going to say the wrong thing or that we're going to break that trust. But, overwhelmingly, I think parents are saying to us that they want to be asked those questions. And if those questions are asked in a curious and non-judgmental way, then, I think as Rachel's saying, hopefully that trust doesn't get broken.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. Clare, maybe, or Dan, how would you approach using these questions, having these conversations when working with people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, particularly societies, communities where there might be an attitude of children should be seen and not heard, where maybe there isn't the same sort of weight given to these domains in a child's life? How would you go about having these conversations?
Well, I think, that the baseline of curiosity is fantastic. If you had decided to do some eco-mapping, again, if I'm developing an eco-map with someone, I'm automatically asking where they were born, where their parents were born, where they're living now, where siblings are living. So again, it's a direct inquiry into cultural diversity, and then having conversations about, how much, if they've immigrated to Australia or they're a refugee, exploring that with them first, being curious about that and how much of their culture is still present with them in Australia, what do they miss? And also asking the questions, is there anything in Australia then that's, a cultural aspect that, you like and new? So again, it's all that gentle scaffolding, I think, around culture, being really curious to learn more about it, and just not being afraid to ask about children and ask about their children's cultural experiences. I think we can get afraid about asking, but again, if we're polite and curious, most people will want to tell us about that. So it's a really, acknowledge that we know that children who are born in Australia from parents overseas or who have immigrated at an early age, walk the line between two cultures, and explain that to parents, and then ask for their view on it, what they think, do they see that and notice that.
Great, thank you. Dan, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Oh, I think Clare answered that really beautifully, actually. I think, I couldn't add too much to that. I think, I was just going to say that cultural curiosity, and I think once you do that, then you will discover parents from any cultural region, the parental ethics and what's important to them. And, you know, you can make some guesses that will be around parent-child relationship and that will be around their child's emotions and behaviours. Might look a little bit different, but if you have that curious conversation, you'll get all that information, as Claire's saying.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. This is a question from Dr. Jacquie. It came through pretty early on, and I believe it was directed at Rachael. They say, thanks for sharing your significant story. Indeed, courageous of you to share. I agree. If I may ask, how did you and when did you realise, and what made you realise that your child was affected by your and your partner's fighting and behaviour?
Well, unfortunately, it took a little bit longer than those sessions I was having with that counsellor for me to realise. It actually took something way more traumatic, going all the way down the path to actual child removal. And that's when I really started to learn about how my actions were affecting my children. By then it was children and not child anymore. So, yeah, that was rather unfortunate. I sort of feel that if I'd have learnt something earlier than that, like perhaps in those counselling sessions, that I might not have ended up down the path that I did. But, yeah, unfortunately, it did take removal. But I am pleased to say that my children were only in care for 6 months, and then I worked really hard to have them return to my care. And I learnt a lot through the child protection services at Flinders, where I was introduced to like attachment theory, things I'd never heard of, and I learnt a lot about the child's developing brain and things I had no education about, no clue about, and they were the big eye-openers and the big turnaround points for me.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that with us as well. It's very brave of you, and we appreciate it. On the topic of child protection, Ruby asks, I work in child protection and quite often the relationship practitioners have with parents feels very adversarial, particularly in the court arena. Does the panel have any tips for helping child protection workers to overcome the institutional barriers that exist between them and parents?
A new webinar for that one?
Yeah.
No, I was previously a child protection worker as well, and that's a massive conversation. Dan, did you want to?
Yeah, I think, that's a whole topic in itself, isn't it? Yeah. But having said that, even though child protection workers do work at the statutory level, and that has its limitations and its challenges, I think there are some amazing and inspirational stories of some child protection workers who still hold a commitment to talking to parents about what they most want for their children, even though they may not be acting in ways at that particular time that are providing consistency and safety to children. But the challenges and the sophistication in that work are obviously significant, and so. It would be very difficult to give a 2-minute answer to that to someone like Ruby, who's already working in child protection and I'm sure comes across these challenges every day.
Yeah, I think something very small, and Rachel's highlighted this, is despite the conflict you can have with parents, particularly through court, is every time you can pick up on a strength, no matter how small it is, that goes a long way to encouraging parents to, do what they can. And even if that's not with their caseworker and it's with other services you refer out to know that the caseworker sees the small strengths, and it might be really small, but seizing on those moments, acknowledging that small strength, and it just can create, bigger and more just from that little tiny sentence of acknowledgement about something that you notice in that person.
Mm. Can I just say something? Sometimes I think that the adversity isn't such a bad thing, not really. Like, it doesn't have to stop everything from going forward and happening. I had a really adversarial relationship with my intake and assessment worker, and I think looking back on it, everyone probably thought this is never going to work. I thought that at the start that this was never going to work with her, but she ended up being the actual best thing for me because she just wouldn't take any crap. And I couldn't just talk over her. I couldn't put her down. I said some horrible things to her, like it's terrible. But the fact that she wouldn't take any crap from me, and she always brought everything back to being about my children. Yep. So eventually it finally got through my thick skull that this wasn't all about me, because in the beginning, I didn't realise that we weren't the clients. I thought we were their clients, but we weren't. Our children were. See, and I did not get that. So if she hadn't have stuck to her guns the way she did, I don't think I ever would have learned anything. But, she was clever. She got other people in to work with me as well. So I had like different relationships with those other people, but that adversity sort of never really left between me and her until afterwards. And then when I could look back on it and I could see what she'd done for me, I couldn't thank her more. Like, she was probably the best thing that ever happened to me in that sense. So sometimes adversity is not always a bad thing.
Yeah, thank you. I don't even know what to say. Unfortunately, we're getting really close to the end of the webinar, and it feels like that is a really great place to wind up the Q&A. We had a great comment from Isabel that says, always use empathy whenever you work with people, even if you only have a few minutes. This can be a game changer for anyone reaching out for help. And I really agree. I'm sure the panel would agree as well. Thank you for everyone who submitted a question. I'm sorry that we weren't able to get to all of them. I feel like there's never enough time for all of the great questions in these Q&A sessions. But we really appreciate you engaging with the webinar and with the panel and submitting those. Thank you again, Rachael, Dan and Claire, for your presentations tonight. I wondered if you could each sum up for us in a sentence or two your reflections on collaborating in this particular area of making children visible in practice. Dan, I'll let you go first.
Thanks, Jacquie. Yeah, I suppose my final thought is, working at Emerging Minds and talking to so many parents, the thing that's really struck with me is the insidious impact that shame and secrecy can have on their lives and their ability to reach out to someone to talk about the issues they currently have with their kids. And what we know about secrecy is that it's really one of the leading causes of child mental health issues in Australia. So as an adult focused practitioner, I think you're just in such a privileged position to be able to work with parents in ways that open up possibilities for them to have conversations and to actually really help them to breathe a sigh of relief that they're actually finally free to talk about some of these concerns. I'd just like to encourage everyone just to, give it a go, to, give yourself permission to ask these child-focused questions, to understand that it won't always go perfectly, but overwhelmingly it will be really beneficial for parents and children.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Claire, did you have any reflections that you'd like to share with us?
I very much agree with Dan about the secrecy and listening to Rachael and the questions coming through. I often think it's our fear as practitioners about asking parents, being more upfront and asking respectful, gentle but direct questions. Sometimes the fear is on our side, and if we can let go of that fear a little bit and walk into that space, we're really met very well by parents in their responses. I sort of think, the worst thing someone's going to say is, mind your own business, don't ask me that question, and that's easy to respond to. I think people aren't going to talk all day. Like Rachael said, you don't know what you don't know. You don't know the questions to ask, or it's shameful and it's secret. And by someone actually being direct and opening up that space to say, oh, I didn't think anyone would ever ask me that question, it creates a very safe space to do that. So I think it's about us, looking at our fear and finding that bravery in ourselves.
Sure. Thank you, Claire. And Rachael, did you have any parting words that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, I agree with the last comment that came through about the empathy. I think we really can just not have enough empathy with people, and trying to understand their worldviews and where they're coming from and how their families fit together, and I suppose it's just the fact that people only know what they know, and they, if they're willing to learn something else, and if you're willing to teach them something else, then, you can open up a whole new world for people. And I just think it's worth sticking with, but just stay empathetic, stay true, don't beat around the bush.
So good. I feel like we could put that on a t-shirt. Great. Thanks, guys. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and your stories and experiences with us tonight. We really appreciate it. And thanks everyone for tuning in and participating with us. You can find supporting resources, including the PERCS conversation guide, by clicking on the information icon, that lowercase I, in the lower right-hand corner of your screen, or by visiting www.emergingminds.com.au. We'd love to get your feedback on tonight's webinar. You'll see a pie chart icon in the lower right-hand corner of your screen next to the speech bubble. If you click on that, you'll get a link to our feedback survey. Otherwise, if you hang around until the very end, a message will pop up on your screen after this webinar ends. Statements of attendance will be issued in about 4 to 6 weeks, and you'll be sent a link to the recording when it's available as well. Just winding up, a few words about the partnership between MHPN and Emerging Minds. This webinar was co-produced by MHPN and Emerging Minds for the Emerging Minds National Workforce Centre for Child Mental Health project. The National Workforce Centre for Child Mental Health is funded by the Australian Government Department of Health under the National Support for Child and Youth Mental Health Program. If you'd like to continue collaborating with local practitioners, MHPN has 373 networks around Australia, as well as online networks. Project officers are available to help connect you to interdisciplinary networks across metropolitan, regional, rural and remote Australia, either face-to-face or online. If you're interested in joining or even starting a network, please visit MHPN's online map or contact Jacquie O'Loughlin at networks@mhpn.org.au. Before I close, I'd like to acknowledge the consumers and carers who have lived experience of adversity, both in the past and in the present, and who have kindly shared their time and experience with us and wisdom. And thanks again to our panel. Thank you all for joining us this evening, and we'll see you soon.